everyone, I'm Carolyn. Welcome back to As I See It. I was just practicing my video that I was going to make today about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And in practicing this in my mind and kind of walking around the desert talking to myself, I used a term that I use a lot. And I realized that in order for us to have conversations about these tough issues, social, political, economic issues, we need to be on the same page about definitions of certain words and catchphrases. And this is a term that I use quite often, and it's often misunderstood, especially by the people I think who are most affected by it. And that term is toxic masculinity. I use it a lot. I talk about it a lot. And so today I thought before we go any further in our discussion about Putin or all the other social issues and things that we're going to talk about, I thought it's really important to make sure that we're all on the same page about what toxic masculinity actually means. And I think some of you might be surprised. So let's get started. I didn't want to just talk off the cuff about this, even though I felt like I had a pretty good idea about what toxic masculinity means, but I wanted to do a little bit of research and make sure I'm bringing you information from experts. So I found a definition of toxic masculinity as a set of attitudes and ways of behaving stereotypically, that's the key word, stereotypically associated with or expected of men, regarded as having a negative impact on men and society as a whole. So it's really like a hyper masculine based on stereotypes, based on really old school, outdated stereotypes about what men are supposed to be. And the reason I want to talk about this is because a lot of people hear toxic masculinity, a lot of people who don't know, who don't bother to look at it and research it and understand it, a lot of people hear that term and think that people are calling all masculinity, all men, toxic. And that's not the case. And in fact, on my live stream on this channel on Saturday, I asked you guys, what do you think the world would look like if it were run by women instead of men? And not surprising, I expected it. A few people said, well, I know women who are just as awful, toxic, basically, and aggressive as men. And that's the problem with toxic masculinity. It doesn't just affect men. It affects all of society and it affects women. I myself have had touches of toxic masculinity throughout my experience in life. Needing to be tough. I can't ask for help. Those are stereotypical roles that we assign to boys and men that end up being toxic. So a few examples of this are telling boys to man up when they feel upset or justifying abusive and inappropriate behavior with the phrase, boys will be boys. So let's talk about those two things for a second. Number one, telling boys that they need to man up. I know this from seeing it in my own house growing up. You need to man up. You need to fight. You need to use your fists. Whereas my brother was bullied, he was taught to fight, to be mean and angry, and I was taught to just ignore it. Just ignore it. It'll go away, or just laugh. Just laugh with him. There was a huge key difference in how we were both taught to deal with bullies. Nobody told me to punch bullies. I did. And that's where my learned behavior, that's what I learned. You know, that was my own toxic masculinity. But so that's an example of toxic masculinity. Not allowing boys to be upset. Not allowing boys to have emotions. Man up. Don't be a sissy. I remember that one. How many of you heard that? Don't be a sissy. Don't be a pansy. So this toxicity is just stripping boys of a humanity, of a nurturing, of a, I want to say softer, but I don't know even if that's the right word. We all, according to some sociologists and psychologists in our history, Carl Jung, and I think even the other one, the big one, Freud, we all internally, innately are born with a masculine and feminine side, a nurturing side versus more of an aggressive side. I've been challenged on that. Yes, men came up with that, with those theories. So, but that is what most psychology and psychiatry is based on, you know, that there is a female and a male side to all of us. And what happens in toxic masculinity is it completely obliterates that feminine, that more nurturing, that softer, in touch with feelings, being able to cry, it completely obliterates that from boys and men, leaving nothing but this toxic, tough masculinity. And yeah, it can be stripped from women too. It was from me. I couldn't cry. Stop crying. I'll give you something to cry about. So even though I wasn't taught to punch the bullies, there were other ways, definitely, that toxic masculinity was instilled in me as well. And it took a lot of years of therapy for me to undo that and to get more in touch with my feminine side. And that played out in a lot of different ways. You'll have to read my memoir. The second way that toxic masculinity can be played out in boys is when boys are aggressive, when they're mean, when they punch girls, when they snap their bra straps in school, when they don't take no for an answer even. What's the common phrase that we hear? Oh, boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. That's just a boy being a boy. That's also an example of toxic masculinity. Why does aggression have to be boys being boys? And why is it acceptable? It shouldn't be acceptable. Nobody has the right to hit another person. We shouldn't be able to just say, oh, boys being boys, or be aggressive or mean or bullying, right? So this new idea, maybe newish idea of toxic masculinity, when you look at it in these terms, actually starts to make sense. This is something that we have just accepted all of our lives, but does it have to be that way? Do boys have to be aggressive? Do boys have to be bullies? No. Let's take that toxic element out of manhood and boyhood and masculinity and nurture their more feminine side so that they're more balanced. What's wrong with that, right? Men, I mean, how many of you, I know a lot of you as you get older, and the men in my audience in my RV channel have gotten to that point. The men in my audience are able to be in touch with that more quote-unquote feminine side. You're able to be introspective. You're able to reflect. You're able to empathize. You're able to understand when a woman says, yeah, you know, this has happened to me and this is my experience. You're able to understand without thinking I'm blaming you or accusing you. You're able to see outside yourself. Toxic masculinity, on the other hand, is defensive. It's aggressive, not assertive. It says no, no, no. It pushes back against anything quote unquote feminine. Feelings, heart to heart, tears, sometimes even affection. Right? And this is all what toxic masculinity does to all of us. Think about all the men in your life who have been emotionally unavailable. It comes from a history of being taught that men shouldn't show their feelings. Is that productive to anyone? Rather than showing, you're not allowed to show feelings. Men, you're not allowed to cry. A lot of you were taught you're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to show feeling, but it's okay to punch. It's okay to kick. It's okay to scream. It's okay to yell. It's okay to get drunk and take your anger out on your dog or your wife or your friend. You know, boys will be boys, you know, get drunk and have fist fights. That's okay, but it's not okay to cry. If that's not the definition of toxicity, I don't know what is. You feel me? Does that make sense? So traits of toxic masculinity include themes of mental and physical toughness, which I talked about. You have to be tough. You can't show any emotion. Especially think about like working white collar men or blue collar men, but you know, men in the corporate world. You know, it's a dog eat dog world. You do whatever it takes to climb the ladder, and that's okay because you're a man and that's what's expected of you. A woman, on the other hand, and I'm going to talk about that. I've been really wanting to do a video about Kamala Harris and all of the lies and rumors about her and the difference between male aggression and drive to climbing the corporate ladder versus women and how they're perceived. I'm going to talk about that. It's going to be an interesting conversation. So traits of toxic masculinity also include aggression. I talked about that. Stoicism, or not being able to display emotion. Talked about that, right? How many of us know men in our lives who aren't very good at displaying emotion? You know, they may not be violent, they may not punch or yell or scream, but they're closed off. They can't show emotion. you can't get through to them. That's toxic masculinity. They've been taught, they were groomed at a very, very, very young age not to show emotion, because only sissies and babies and little girls cry, right? This might be hard to hear for some, those terms, sissy and things like that, but I grew up hearing them in my house. And I know many of you probably did too. It's unhealthy. Not only does it create unhealthy boys, it creates unhealthy men. It creates men who are closed off, who have all this pent-up emotion that they don't have an outlet for because they haven't been given the tools to properly and healthfully display emotion. And what happens when you have all that pent-up emotion that has nowhere to go? Sadness is anger. Fear is anger. Everything, the most raw form of every emotion that I've learned in therapy is anger. So when you don't have the tools or the ability or the permission to express sadness, fear, hunger, need, the need for love, when you don't have a healthy way to express those things, they're going to turn into anger. And that's where a lot of the toxic masculinity that we see comes from. That capped off emotion. Self-sufficiency is another theme of toxic masculinity, and that's something that I'm definitely guilty of. I don't need any help. I can do it myself. I've gotten better. Usually though, for me, it's like I've tried everything else and then I'll ask for help. But so, like I said, toxic masculinity isn't just men, and it's not all men. You know, again, just because you put toxic and masculinity together to explain this phenomena doesn't mean all masculinity and all men are toxic. It does not mean that, nor does it mean that it can't also apply to women. We all grew up in the patriarchy. We all grew up under this system. Women have seen the men in their lives go through this. Many of us who've had toxic masculine fathers also have many of these traits. So women can be toxically masculine. Same thing. Remember what I said earlier? The toxic masculine is about suppressing the feminine. Women's feminine gets suppressed too. Marjorie Taylor Greene is an excellent example. Look how tough and strong she thinks she has to be, right? Remember the movie G.I. Jane? At the end, she became toxically masculine because she had to in order to survive in the environment. Stripped away of all, remember, what did she say? Suck my dick, I think, right? Stripped away all femininity. She had to in order to survive in the environment she was in. Many women have had to suppress their femininity in order to survive in the situations they have been in. So a woman can be just as masculine, toxic masculine, as men. We also have learned that it's not okay to cry. You have to suppress any feelings. For me, it was survival. You know, showing any sign of weakness was about, I couldn't show weakness. I literally might die. So self-sufficiency, have to do everything myself. I can't ask for help. I was taught not to ask for help. That's a whole other story. And emotional, the final one is emotional insensitivity. And again, that's just about being closed off with your own feminine and that nurturing side that we all have. We all have a nurturing side within us. It's just that for too many men, it has been beaten out of them. Literally and figuratively. So emotional insensitivity comes from not being able to acknowledge your own feelings. How can you be sensitive to another's feelings when you can't even acknowledge your own? When you're so closed off, right? And I think we can all relate to this. When you're not feeling, when you're feeling closed off emotionally, like I can't feel, you can't be sensitive to the feelings of others. So that's another trait of toxic masculinity. All right. So I was thinking about Putin. I want to do a video because Putin, I think, is a classic textbook example right now, probably always, of toxic masculinity. There are a lot of other examples in this world today. The former guy of toxic masculinity, and I do want to talk more about it, but I thought that it would help us all to be on the same page about what it really means. That it doesn't mean that men are toxic. It doesn't mean that all masculinity is toxic. It means that there is a phenomenon of toxic masculinity that is taught to boys mostly and some women that hurts us all. It hurts men, it hurts the women in their lives, and it hurts society. So there's a lot more to come. Leave your comments below. Say, yes, I have. Leave your comment. Yes, I have. If you have experienced toxic masculinity in your life. Yes, I have in the comments below. And I'll see you soon with more about Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Thanks for hanging with me. Be sure to subscribe.